In this video I'll be showing how to build a computer. The first thing I'm going to do on this build is I'm going to install the optical drive first. I'll take you through all the steps going from just a pile of parts to a complete computer. I'm going to do the optical drive first because oftentimes, depending on what case you have, the front panel has to come off. So it really just varies based on your case. But to determine if it needs to come off, you can go ahead and open up the side panel. And you'll see here, in this case, we've got 2 bays for optical drives and 2 bays for hard drives or any kind of 3.5-inch drive. You can also use an adapter to put a solid-state drive there. This case does require you to take off this front panel to get to where you need to install this drive. So what we're going to do is flip it up. If you can see this. Underneath here, there's commonly a little hand spot that you can pop. That's going to help you get all of these little kind of plastic rivets out of the way. I'll see if I can show them to you. Okay. So if you look in here, you'll see these little plastic kind of rivets, and they just push out. So what we're going to do is just follow this case out the side. Pry it off. Sometimes it'll pop off quite violently like that, but just try and be as easy as you can so as not to snap anything. So you can see here. So you can see how it works. Okay, so once you've got the front panel popped off, you'll notice that oftentimes, especially on cheaper cases like this, you're going to have a little kind of thing that you have to pop out. And once you've got the area free, you can go ahead and insert the drive. Now I'm going to go ahead and place screws on both sides. Some people only do it on one side, but I like to be thorough. Now if you'll notice on the front panel, they usually come with a little cover like this. So you just flip it over, and then there are some little tabs, and you can kind of just press them like that, and it'll come out. Okay. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to put the front cover back on while the drive is loose. Snap it back on. Okay. And then you'll be able to move the drive out to where you want to have it sit. So you want to make sure it's flush. Okay. And then you can see on the side here that there are holes, and these are where you put the screws. So just line it up and put the screws in. I'm going to do it on the back side as well, and then you will have mounted your optical drive. So go ahead and do that. I'm going to make a quick note here for those of you who haven't built a computer before. There are 2 common threads for a computer screw. One is a smaller thread. Let's see if I can get it here in focus. I'm not sure if that's going to be focused. One is a smaller thread, and then one is a larger thread, which commonly has a hex backing on it. The reason I'm pointing this out is because your DVD drive is going to have the smaller thread, so make sure you don't try and force in one of the larger thread ones, because that will strip it. The next thing that I'm going to do, this is a smaller case, so you kind of have to think about which components you're going to put in first just to make sure that they'll all fit without having to worry about taking stuff out later. So the next thing I'm going to put in is the hard drive. Now I'm going to be using a 2.5-inch hard drive, so this is going to be the same thing if you have a solid-state drive, but I'm going to use a 2.5-inch hard drive and an adapter plate. This is just a 3.5-inch to 2.5-inch adapter plate, and it's going to sit like that on the adapter plate and be inserted here. Okay, so the way you mount these commonly is on a laptop drive or solid state drive, there are holes on the bottom like that. You just fit it in, line up the holes, and screw it on. So go ahead and do that if you have a solid state drive that you need to install. Okay, so now that you've got it mounted, and again, these ones are also the smaller thread type screws. Once you've got it mounted, now we're going to install it in the 3.5-inch bay. If you're using a normal hard drive, the holes are going to be in the same spot. So right now, it's just as if we have a 3.5-inch hard drive. Okay, so you put it in one of these slots. Make sure it's on top of the rails. There are some little tiny tabs folded over that serve as rails. And this is where we're going to use some of these larger thread screws. So you want to make sure it lines up. Now be careful because there are several holes in the side of a hard drive, so you want to make sure, don't try and push it all the way in because you'll push this cover off, and don't leave it hanging all the way out because then you won't have any space for the rest of your stuff. So go ahead and line up the holes and go ahead and mount it. I'll shut this off so I'm not wasting video time, but go ahead and mount this. I recommend mounting on both sides just as the same way we did the optical. Alright, so now that I've got it mounted firmly in here, you've got two options. You can either put in the power supply next, or you can put in the motherboard next. I'm going to go ahead and put the motherboard in first, just because this is a smaller case. As you can see, this is a micro ATX case, but I'm going to go ahead and do the motherboard first, just because I think that it's going to be easier to navigate everything with the motherboard already in there before I go cramming wires in. So go ahead and set up your motherboard. Alright, so now we're going to set up the motherboard. I like to set it up before I get it in the case, just because it's easier to work with. If you've bought the CPU and motherboard separately, this is how you insert it. Now I'm working on an AM3 socket here. Intel ones will be slightly different, but basically the same thing. You can look at the top of the processor. You'll notice that there's a little triangle here on this corner. On the CPU socket there is also a little triangle, so just make sure it lines up. Be very careful on the bottom. See all these little pins? Don't bend them. They're not extremely fragile, like you can set it down, but just be careful with it. Obviously they're pretty expensive, so just set it in. When you set it in, make sure it's all the way in with the lever up. So make sure it's in, and then just push the lever down, and now it's installed. Next, you'll want to put your heatsink on top of it. Now I'm just going to use a stock heatsink. The stock heatsinks usually come with some thermal paste on the bottom, but if you've bought a used setup like this one, you'll need to add your own. So I'm just going to get my thermal paste. I'm going to be using some Cooler Master stuff. Usually the standard is Arctic Silver 5, but you can really just use any name brand stuff. Really they're all within a couple of degrees of each other. And what you're going to want to do is right in the middle put about a small pea-sized amount in the middle. Now there are several methods to spreading the thermal paste. Some people say it's best to just leave it in the middle and let the pressure of the heatsink kind of blend it out for you. Other people say put your finger in a plastic bag and just kind of make sure it's even. Some people use a razor blade. Really there's a bunch of methods. I'm not sure that any have been actually proven to be the best, but I'm going to just go ahead and let the pressure of the heatsink spread this out. So what you're going to want to do is, this is an AM3 cooler. You're just going to put it right down on top of the CPU, and you hook this side like that, and then this side hooks on the other side, and then just turn the lever, and now it's installed. And obviously don't forget to install your fan. Now, since there are so many different types of heat sinks, it's hard to say exactly how to install yours. Some of them require removing this bracket right here, whilst some of them just use the bracket like this one does. If you're using a stock heatsink, it's just going to use this bracket here. So now that we have the heatsink installed, and you can take like a little zip tie and kind of tie this up to keep it nice and neat. I'll do that later. You're going to want to install the RAM. Now if you look, this is DDR3 RAM. If you look, one side will be shorter than the other side, so that's really what you need to pay attention to when you're installing it in the board. And if you look you can see in the slot which one will be shorter and longer. Make sure that all the tabs are out, and when you're installing two RAM sticks like this, they need to go in the same color slots. Okay, so you're going to line it up, kind of set it up in the slot. You're going to want to make sure that you're on like a firm surface so that when you put pressure on it, it doesn't bend the motherboard. So go ahead and push it down. Now when you push it down, you'll hear the little side things snap in. You don't want to put it down and then force these up with your fingers. You want to go ahead and just put the stick in the slot and then let the pressure of you putting it in the slot snap it together. Okay? Or else you can have poorly seated RAM. One of the most common things when you're building a new rig, if you turn it on after you've built everything and you just get no video, reseat your RAM. That's probably the problem. Okay, so now that we've got this together, we're going to move on to the next part. Okay, once you've set up your motherboard, then you need to set up the case to take the motherboard. Sometimes this is called a standoff, and what this does is you screw it into the motherboard back plate here, and then you can screw the motherboard down onto it. Sometimes cases come with these installed, sometimes they do not. Oftentimes if they don't, they will come with some sort of way to install them. For instance, I got this with a Linely case that I bought, and I got this, which is just like kind of like a little socket that you use a screwdriver with. I got this with a Cooler Master case. So if you get one of those brands, you probably get something like that. If you don't, what I recommend doing is finger tightening it and then maybe using some needle nose pliers. With these though, be very careful. They're extremely easy to strip, so if you tighten it too tightly, it'll just strip out the threads, so be very careful with that. So go ahead and install them. What you'll want to do, if your back plane is not marked with which holes you're supposed to fill out, you may want to set your motherboard inside just so you can see where the holes in the motherboard are, and then put standoffs in those holes only. It's very important that you don't put standoffs in all of the holes, because for instance down here, my motherboard is standard micro ATX. It's got one right there and one right there. However, if you put a standoff here, it's possible that you could short your motherboard. So make sure that you're only putting standoffs in the holes you need, and make sure that every hole you need has a standoff, because you also don't want to have too few standoffs. So make sure you put the correct number of standoffs in. Okay, so once you've got your case set up with standoffs, you can go ahead and press in the back I/O shield. This is the I/O shield here. Use the one that comes with your motherboard, not the one that comes with your case. Make sure it's in the proper orientation. So if you flip it over like this, it's going to be quite hard to get your motherboard in there, impossible. So kind of eyeball your motherboard and make sure this is going the correct way. Just fit it in there, press it in there like that. Okay, now we're ready to put the motherboard in. When you're inserting the motherboard, especially in a case like this where it's very small, make sure that you're very careful around these components, because motherboards are very delicate. I actually recommend that you do not what I'm doing right here, but maybe have an anti-static wristband, something like that. You'll probably want to be working, if you're touching a motherboard, not on carpet. You want to be on hard floors, hard surface, but this is the only space I have right now. So go ahead and gently install your motherboard. Some cases like this, you'll have to kind of scoop it underneath the hard drive area. So go ahead and set your motherboard. Okay, now what I'm looking at over here is how, see there's some like little tabs. You're going to want to make sure, some tabs are just little presses that press on this, that give it some pressure to hold this in place, and some tabs like this one are meant to go above the components here. So make sure that when you're pressing this out, you need to look back here and make sure none of these ports are blocked. Make sure it's lining up right. So go ahead and do that and make sure your motherboard is lined up. Okay, so my motherboard is all lined up. Now what you're going to want to do is screw down the motherboard. Okay, now the easiest way to do this is to make sure you're gonna get a little back pressure from the back plate, and that's fine, but you're gonna want to make sure that all the holes are lining up correctly. When you have it in place, all of them are lining up correctly. Now if you're using a low quality case like this, what you're gonna want to do is screw in corners, kind of like if you're putting in a tire, like screwing on a wheel or something. You're gonna want to do it in a pattern that goes from like here, 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 here. And screw them in, but just loosely, so that there's still a little bit of play, so that if the holes are slightly off, which they probably won't be, but if they are, you'll have a little bit of room so that you can get all of the screws in there. Again, you don't want to set this in here with just 3 screws. Make sure that all of the holes have screws in them. My standoffs use the smaller threads, by the way, but I have seen standoffs that use the bigger ones. So make sure you're using the correct screws. Okay, before I put the power supply in, while I have all this room, I'm going to go ahead and hook up the fans in this case. Now there are only 2 fans in this case. What they have are these little fan connectors, little 3-pin fan connectors. Or they can sometimes use a Molex connector, which is a larger 4-pin one. But you're going to look for on the motherboard, usually it'll have 2, 3, sometimes 4 fan headers. A little connection where this can plug in. Now if you look at the top of this, there are 2 little ears on the sides, so make sure that's the side that goes in where there is a flat side on the connector. So let me see if I can zoom in here. So if you're not familiar, you can see what one looks like. This is the fan connector right here. Okay, this is a very common placement. Usually there's one back here, one up above the CPU for the CPU fan, and then one in the front for the intake fan. Let's go ahead and install this. Okay, once you've got, I've already hooked that one up. Once you've got these 2 connections, then we're going to do these connections. This is, I mean, if any part of doing this is hard or tedious, it's hooking these up, just because there's not a standardized connector and you have to hook all of them up individually. But we're going to go ahead and hook all these things up. We've got the audio, USB, and these are the front panel connections, like your power button, reset button, and then your lights. An audio cable will generally be like this if it's got backwards compatibility with the older AC97 connection. I don't remember the last time I saw a motherboard with that. Most of them are going to have this HD audio one. It's a very simple plug. There's just 1 pin missing, so you can't install it incorrectly. Now usually these are at the bottom of the motherboard. Some people like to, let's see if I can get a better view here. So these are all along the bottom here, as you can see. Some people like to run these cables underneath the motherboard. I don't really like doing that if I can avoid it, just because sometimes there's not enough room under there. And as you see in this case, there's literally no room for cables back here. So we're going to try and do the best we can with cable management. Cable management is just the idea that you don't want bundles of cables in front of fans, so that there's good airflow coming through the case. Okay, so you're going to notice on your motherboard there will be writing that tells you where things go. USB is very easy. There's again 1 pin missing, and it will just plug in. I don't know if you can see it, but it will just plug in like that. Okay, the audio panel is also very simple. Get this out of the way. It's also very simple. Usually, for some reason, it's back in the bottom left quadrant of the motherboard, and that again just plugs in like the USB. Now if you see here, this cable is reaching across the motherboard. I really don't like doing that if I can avoid it, but sometimes, like in this instance, you can't avoid it. So just do the best you can and kind of try and keep it out of the way. We're going to zip tie all these cables later, so just kind of lay them out here as they are. The next thing you're going to want to do are these ones. Again, these are the most tedious ones that you have to hook up. What you're looking for is something called FP panel, or it's just the front panel. Sometimes it'll say FP or F panel, depends on the motherboard what they call it, but you can see it here on this one, right down here. Okay, this one just says panel. And we're going to go ahead and open up our motherboard manual. If you don't have a motherboard manual, it's always online, so you can always download one online from your motherboard manufacturer, and you're going to find which pins correspond to which functions. These are all labeled, as you can see. There's going to be one positive and one ground. So in your motherboard manual, it'll say plus sign and a negative sign, or maybe line and ground, maybe, but these all correspond to individual pins on that panel header. So go ahead and figure out which ones go where, plug them in, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, I've got all mine installed just so you can see the diagram you're looking for. It's going to look something like this, wherein it tells you where everything goes. Your case, if you buy a new case, it's going to come with this. This is a case speaker. It's not for playing music. It is just to help you diagnose problems. If you have some sort of like a memory issue or something, it'll give you beep codes that you can use to diagnose it. Make sure you plug this in. It doesn't really look needed, and you probably might not even use it ever, but make sure you plug it in because it's important for diagnostic stuff. Red is going to be positive, so we'll see here. It goes on the top of the front panel header. I'm going to go ahead and install this. Okay, so we are installed there. It doesn't really matter where you put it. We'll organize this stuff later. But as you see, now we've got almost everything installed. We do have to still put in the power supply. Let's see if I can turn this up. We do still have to put in the power supply, but that's not too big a deal. Before I put in the power supply, because I don't like messing with all the wires, I'm going to connect the data connections for my hard drive and optical drive right now. Okay, so I grabbed my SATA cables. I've got some nice right angle ones that I'm going to use. These are very simple to install. You just put them the only place they'll fit, just like that. And I'm going to actually route mine through this, like back through here, and then bring them down around so I can avoid blocking some of this airflow, and tie them with these. So what you're going to do, just plug them in here and then plug them in down here. Now it doesn't really matter which port you plug it into. If you've only got one of each like this, it's not really going to matter, but I do like to do the hard drive in 0 and the optical drive in 1. They're going to be numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So that's just kind of what I like to do. Go ahead and connect those. Okay, now we're going to install the power supply. It's pretty straightforward. What you're going to do is drop it in where it sits here on top. Now, if you're using a cheaper case like this one, it may require a little persuasion to get it in there. As you notice here, this is very close to this piece of this metal tab. So in those cases, you may want to have some snips or something just to trim it off a little bit. But it looks like we're going to be able to fit this one in here. And then you're going to take 4 of the larger thread screws. Go ahead and mount it. Okay, and then once you've got it mounted, well, let me make a note here. This case, if you take this back panel off, does not have a lot of space back here. Some cases do. They'll have maybe an inch or less of space, but enough space to where if you wanted to, you can pull the wires back through here and drape them around, so just to hide them and get them out of the way of the airflow. Unfortunately, on this case, there's not enough room to do that, so I'm going to have to figure out ways to hide these cables and get them out of the way of the airflow just on this side of the case. The main connectors you're going to want to look at first are these two connectors. You're going to have a 24 pin. This is a 20 plus 4. Some of the newer ones are just all 24. Some older ones are just a 20 pin. You're going to need this one, and it's going to go right there. Really the only spot that it could go, right here. 24 pin connector, and you just push it down into place. The other connector, and this one's very important, this is another reason that if you try and boot up a computer and you get no video, you probably forgot to hook this one up. This is a little 4-pin. Some newer or higher end computers will be 8-pin, but the principle is the same. It is, let's see if I can get it on the screen here, right there. And this is a very common place for it. So you'll either have a 4 or an 8-pin right in this general area up here. Okay, so go ahead and plug those in, and we will do the next part. Okay, so now that you've got your 4-pin and your 24-pin all installed, the next thing you're going to want to do is look at your optical drive and hard drive, and you'll see that there's a power connector right next to where you connected the SATA connector. So you're going to go ahead and get the appropriate cable and just plug it in. Now, in my case, this one cable is probably going to reach for both of these, so that's how I'm going to do it. I'm just going to plug one into the top and one into the bottom, because you want to use as few cables as possible, really, just to help out your airflow. And then what you're going to want to do is go ahead and tie these ones back out of the way, because you're not going to use them right now, just to make sure they're not in the way. This last cable on my power supply is a 6-pin. If you have a newer power supply, it's probably going to come with like a 6-pin and an 8-pin. Those are for graphics cards. This build is not going to have a graphics card, but I'll go ahead and just go through some stuff later about what you'd want to do for if you have a graphics. Alright, so this is what your finished product is going to look like. Let's see if I can, hopefully you can see this. I've just gone ahead and zip tied these cables here and hidden all these, put a zip tie around the excess ones and stuck them in an empty bay. And this is just going to make sure that all this area is going to be used for airflow, so you're not going to have any blockage of that. If you have a more expensive case, you'll probably have even better cable management. This case just doesn't have a lot of options for me. One note though, when you're zip tying these things, make sure that you're not pulling on the cables when you're zip tying them. So don't use the zip tie to like crank them together, and don't yank them and kind of try and hook them around stuff. You want to make sure that there's slack on these so they're not pulling, or else you'll have problems in the future. But that's it, really. That's all that it takes to build a computer. If you do have a graphics card, a lot of these cases, the way it works is you just stick a screwdriver in here and pry out one of these panels. If it's a more expensive case, it'll be a screwed-in cover that you unscrew. Note here, if I can get this, can't really see it, but this is where your graphics card will probably go. It's PCI Express 16X slot, this is PCI Express 1X slot, and these are just normal PCI slots. So you could use these for like wireless cards and stuff like that. It's pretty self-explanatory to install those. So that's it. Doesn't take very long at all.